everybody, this is Melissa again, and this is a video for, it says week 15, but I meant to write chapter 15, part 2. It's still week 15, I guess, so that works out okay. And this is the second half of chapter 15 on art of Carolingian and Etonian periods. So following along in your packet, we're on page 18. So we have finished in the last section with a section on Hiberno-Saxon art of Ireland, England, and Scotland, and a section on Norse and Viking art of Scandinavia. And so now we're going to take a look at what happens a little bit later in the later part of the early Middle Ages. And so we're dealing with the Carolingian period, which is about 768 to 877. And focuses on the reign of Charlemagne and his successors. And then the latter century of that millennium, 919 to 1002, the Etonian Empire. So let's go ahead and take a look at a map, as we like to do. All right, let's take a look at a map. There we go. All right, so what you're looking at here is a pretty good sort of depiction of what we're dealing with in the Carolingian period. So I'm going to kind of set you up for understanding what this map means here. So this new period that we're talking about, the Carolingian Empire, Carolingian period, this time from about 768 to 877, is a time when an individual, Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great, which is what Charlemagne means in French, Charles the Great reunited a large portion of Western Europe under a new empire that he basically wanted to make into, to make a long story short, into a Christian Roman Empire. So he wanted to revive the Roman Empire, make it like the Roman Empire had been before, and then make it into a Christian one, a solidly Christian one. So, and then of course he would be the emperor, right? So what else can I tell you to kind of set up for this? Well, the reason that the Carolingian Empire happens, the reason that a large portion of Western Europe, as you can see, France, Germany, and so on, are being reunited. The reason that it happens is because in the couple of hundred years now, so 768, it's been about 300 years since the end of the Western Roman Empire, right? So in that time, there have been developing some problems in the absence of the Roman Empire, in the absence of this large sort of structural force that keeps everything together. Some things that are pretty negative have happened for the people of Europe. So we're talking about all of a sudden, without with all these smaller kingdoms and without an overarching Roman Empire system, you don't have a common currency. So it's difficult to buy things from other groups of people. There is no common military. And so militaries tend to be small and sort of not very well armed and perhaps distrustful of one another. So you don't have that overarching sense of security that you once had with the Roman Empire. Other things have devolved, like education, but probably most importantly to us in terms of why the Carolingian Empire was seen as necessary is because trade routes at this time, and so commerce in general, trading of things that people needed to survive, was really kind of at a standstill, and that's because of all these other things we've talked about. Without a common currency, without a common military, that means there's no security and no way to buy things. And so when people aren't able to engage in commerce, then things really fall apart, right? So so Charles the Great is coming in this vacuum of power, in this vacuum of a valid market. There's also a vacuum for agricultural slavery too. If you think about it, with the Romans, you had all these people who were slaves in the Roman Empire who were forced to make food, right? So if you don't have that system anymore, well, who's making all your food, right? So agriculture becomes a problem too. So that's where we see, remember talking about feudalism last time, and how feudalism with lords and ladies having peasants or serfs, that becomes new agricultural slavery that fulfills that vacuum, right? And then we see the church step in as well. And in fact, there is a great relationship, great, I mean large, not like it was great, like awesome. I mean, like this really important relationship between Charles and the church. And in fact, when Charles decided he wanted to become emperor, he had the backing of then Pope Leo III. Leo III was a guy who, as Pope at that time in the 8th century, was unlike popes who had been before. By this time, popes of the Catholic Church in the West were wealthy people. They were educated people. They were people who were the elite, right? They weren't like just like, oh, let's pick the holiest guy, we can be pope. No, that's not how the pope was chosen. The pope was chosen among the elite of society, right? And Leo was not. Leo III was not among that elite of society. And so he actually felt his life was threatened and probably sought out help directly from Charles. And this is kind of like a great model for feudalism, right? You know, that remember, feudalism is this reciprocal relationship between secular rule and religious rule. So, I mean, in this case, you have a great sort of model for that. You have Leo III, a pope who needs the protection of a secular ruler with a military, like Charles the Great. And Charles the Great wants something from Leo, right? Charles the Great wants basically to be, he wants to be crowned emperor, Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. So they both get what they want, right? So Leo gets protection, he gets to be the Pope and not get killed, and Charles gets to be crowned the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, right? Which is exactly what he wants. So you have the beginnings, I will say, too, with Charlemagne's empire, the Carolingian, which Carol is just another way to say Charles. It's just another form of the word Charles, right? The Carolingian Empire is sort of the beginnings of what we call the Holy Roman Empire. This idea that there is a form of the old Roman Empire, a holy Catholic one, right? And that really is codified and solidified in the Ettonian Empire, where they actually did call themselves the Holy Roman Empire. Anyway, this is the first beginnings of that. So, what else can I tell you? Charles married a princess of Lombardy, and Lombard is the sort of northern area of Italy. So that brought more of the Western world into his realm, so to speak. And so again, we've got, notice over here, are Anglo-Saxons and Hiberno-Saxons, right? Just to kind of remind you that we're sort of overlapping with the Carolingian Empire with the last section that we discussed. Now let's take a look at a couple of images of Charlemagne. We don't have a ton of images from the period. I mean, we do have lots of images of him later because he's greatly admired for hundreds of years. But let's take a look at a couple images from the time of his life. So one, we have a coin depicting Charlemagne. And I invite you to look at how Charlemagne is having himself depicted. So it has his name, Carolus, right? Charles, Carolus, Charlemagne. And then the words basically emperor, right, over here. And then take a look at how he looks. He's got this cloak pinned up at his shoulder. Reminds us a lot of a toga that a Roman emperor might wear, or a Roman senator. And then notice that he's wearing on his head a crown of laurel leaves, right? So these two things are absolutely 100% meant to say, hey, I'm like a Roman emperor. I look just like a Roman emperor. That's how he wants to depict himself. And even the fact that he's showing himself in profile on this coin is, you know, definitely in the tradition of Roman coins and of Hellenistic or Greek coins as well. In fact, here is a coin depicting Julius Caesar from the beginnings of the Roman Empire, and you can see that Julius Caesar's wearing a crown of laurel leaves as well. This is another image of Charlemagne. It may be an image of his grandson, Charles the Bald, but in any case, even if it is, it would be reasonable to expect that this is how Charlemagne would have been depicted. In this case, a relatively small piece of statuary, a piece of bronze that had been gilt, covered in gold. And it shows Charles in an equestrian portrait that is sitting on top of a horse, and he's wearing a crown. He's wearing a cloak and leather boots. I'm saying this because these are things, including the mustache, these are things that you would see basically in a Frankish king, that is a barbarian king, right? So Charlemagne, remember, is not Roman. He's actually a Frank. He's the descendant of Frankish kings. So in some images, like in the coin, he might want to show himself as more Roman, But in other images like this one, he might want to show himself as more quote-unquote barbarian or Frankish. And so the large cloak, the leather boots, the crown, and the mustache, right? And then he's holding this sphere, which is something we have seen a few times in this class in depictions of rulers, but especially in depictions of Christ. And that is an orb as a representation of the cosmos or the world or the universe. And so what this is supposed to mean is that Charlemagne is the imperial ruler of the world as he knows it. I mean, we know it's really a relatively small portion of the world, but to him, he is essentially an emperor of the world. Now, I did want to remind you that there is a model for this image too in Roman tradition. We have a surviving example of an equestrian portrait of a Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, and notice that Marcus Aurelius too is bronze with gilt. It's no doubt that Charlemagne or Charles the Bald would have been familiar with this statue, and remember, they would have thought it was Constantine at the time. And definitely Charlemagne is trying to equate himself with Constantine, not necessarily with Julius Caesar or Augustus or Octavian or anyone like that, but more with Constantine, right? He wants to be a Christian Roman emperor. So let's take a look at some artwork from this period that doesn't necessarily depict Charlemagne. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a look at a couple of works of architecture. And architecture at this time is kind of going through a development phase. It's going to lead us into chapters 16 and 17, where we look very heavily at architecture. So we're going to take note of some of these differences from previous chapters, from previous basilica and central plan structures, and see how they look and the decoration and so on. Then we're going to see how that develops continuing into chapters 16 and 17 next week. In general, Charlemagne was very interested in reviving the arts. So we're going to see not only architectural works, but also that he is putting monasteries to work on the mainland to create gospel books and other sorts of small-scale artworks to spread Christianity, and also to engage the arts in a way that would make him seem like a great patron of the arts. That's a sort of way that he wanted to project himself. He wanted to be considered to be a patron of the arts, someone who gave money to the arts, and especially in support of Christianity. All right. So let's take a look here. This is going to be a plan of the Palace Chapel of Charlemagne, which is in Aachen, Germany. And you can see that it is quite a spectacular structure. It looks quite a bit different than the other ones we've seen. It is a little bit different. It's fusing a couple of ideas together. In fact, this is a palace chapel, so it's attached to a palace. But it does, in other ways, look very much like a sort of fusion of basilica with a central or rotunda plan. So we've got some a sort of transept, but we've also got a rotunda. We've got a dome over the top. We also have a couple of new additions that I want to point out to you, which are these two. I don't know why this isn't pointing actually to here, because this is the stair tower here on either side of the entrance. So this main entrance, normally when you go into a basilica plan or a central plan church like we've been going into lately, go into the entrance. There might be a sort of forecourt, there might be an ambulatory. What we haven't seen so far are these stair towers to each side of the entrance. So what that means is these are spiral staircases that go all the way up, right? And they become a fixture of architecture from this point forward, and they're going to change and morph a little bit in chapters 16 and 17. But this becomes, these stair towers, part of what is known as a westwork. Okay, so we have the development in chapter 15 in the Carolingian period of the westwork. What is the westwork? The westwork is the building up and decoration of the western entrance to a church. Okay, so we haven't seen much or any of this yet. It is something that's going to become a very important part of the cathedrals and churches of chapter 16 and 17, and it's beginning here. So the westwork is the western entrance. Now, I don't know if you remember, but maybe you'll remember that when you enter a church, you typically enter from the west so that you're viewing towards the east, which is where the other end of Oh, there goes one of my dogs barking. So you're looking down towards the altar, right? And the altar is in the east because the east is associated with birth and resurrection and therefore Christ, right? All right, so the westwork is essentially then the facade. Okay, the facade, that is the face, right? The face of the building, the main entry of the structure. And so facade is a word we'll use later down the line. During the Carolingian and Etonian periods, we really call it a westwork. So here's the interior. You can see that it's definitely a rotunda, that it has multiple levels. It's quite richly decorated in beautiful stone. There's really not a lot of mosaic. It's not overly decorated like we would see in Byzantine examples. In fact, most of the decoration is in the very upper zones. But you can see how the multiple levels of the rotunda happen. So instead of just having one ambulatory that's open to the roof, there's actually several levels of the ambulatory. It's very rich. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at another example of a Carolingian church. So this is the Abbey Church of Corbie. Now, your book in chapter 15, I believe, talks quite a bit in one section. I can't remember where it's located, but there's a section that talks about kinds of churches and how they're named and all that good stuff. And an abbey church, you may recall, is a church that is made for a monastery or a convent, or an abbey, as we might call a monastery or convent. Abbey is another word for either of those things. In an abbey, of course, is a place where people are cloistered away as monks or nuns to live and to work, etc. So an abbey church is a church on a monastery or a convent, as opposed to, say, a cathedral or a chapel, which is not, right? So here we have the westwork, or the entrance to the Abbey Church of Corbie. So it was done in the late 9th century, that is the late 800s in the Carolingian period, except for the very upper stories. You can see there's a line at about here where it gets sort of rebuilt and built upon several centuries later, and that is very, very typical. Oh, there goes my dogs. Hold on, I'm going to pause it. Okay, so what you can see is that in the 12th century, they really refined and defined those towers as very separate entities. But before that, in the original work, the side towers were just sort of, they're just sort of part of the facade. They don't stick out. They're not extremely decorative. So that westwork, while it still has 2 towers with spiral staircases, it's still just part of the facade. It's not, this westwork, they're not extraordinarily decorative. Something I'll also invite you to take a look at here is how, just like in the Palace Chapel at Aachen, you have a tripartite doorway. This is going to be very common in basilica or longitudinal style churches, in that you might have a main central doorway that might be larger than the other 2, and the other 2 are going to lead into the aisles on either side of the nave. So you'd have, one entry for the middle and the main nave, and then one on either side for the aisles, and you might even have more than that, but most of the time it's three doorways. And the reason is because it's symbolic, right? Not only does it fit well with the typical longitudinal plan, which is one nave and a side aisle on either side, right? But also because of the symbolism to the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So the number 3 is considered a holy number. So let's take a look at some images from illuminated manuscripts, which are made in monasteries in the Carolingian period, but also to some degree in there's a couple of professional sort of scriptoria, which is a scriptorium is where you would see one of these made. So let's take a look at a few examples from, I think we've got Gospels. Here's a gospel lectionary called the Godeskalk Evangelistory. An evangelistory is just a sort of edited gospel book, which has basically kind of the stuff that's needed for Mass. And what you can see is that this is the image from the frontispiece of the Gospel of St. Mark. So St. Mark is he's symbolized by the lion, very cute, right? Look, cute lion as we've seen before, and he seems to be looking back at him. They're both wearing halos that are leafed in gold on the paper. Everything's ink except for this. It's all gold here and there. And then they're looking at each other as if he's looking over his shoulder to his holy symbol for inspiration for what he's writing, and he's actively writing. Now, what I want to point out here in the style is that this looks a little bit different from the Hiberno-Saxon examples. Remember the Hiberno-Saxon examples of illuminated manuscripts? It was like patterns, spirals, millefiori or little tiny cloisonne decorations, interlacings or ribbon-like decorations, very flat figures. And we don't have quite that here. In fact, during the Carolingian period, artists tend to prefer on the mainland, they tend to not use those sort of animal style decorative elements like interlacings and so on, and fantastic beasts. Instead, they make images that have more of a Roman look. Actually Mark kind of looks like a Roman in how he's dressed. He's shown in a sort of three-dimensional way, in the way he is sitting. He's sitting on a very Roman-looking stool with a Roman lectern in front of him. So he's meant to look like a Roman scribe. And again, this is not an accident. This is Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, using a sort of Roman influence style to again solidify that connection between his empire and Rome. All right, let's see what else we can see. We've got a couple more examples from other gospel books. This is the Coronation Gospel Book of Charlemagne. So this would be the one that was used during his coronation as the emperor, so very rich and important book. And you can see that it is the St. Matthew page, so introducing the book of St. Matthew. Once again, St. Matthew looks quite three-dimensional. You can see the artist is using chiaroscuro to make drapery and a solid body underneath. So they're kind of returning in some ways, returning a little bit anyway to something a little bit more realistic to solidify that connection to ancient Rome. And then he's sitting on a very Roman chair and a Roman lectern at which he is writing. This is a really fun one. This is a book known as the Ebo Gospels, and this is a nice picture that shows you the whole book and shows you open to the page of St. Matthew. You can see that they're still heavily decorating the initial letters being the first letter of a section, and they're also using some of these sort of elements of the animal style, right? They're still using these interlacings, what were known as Celtic knotwork and so on. Oh, hold on. That was quite the barking session there. All right, so where were we? Well, so anyway, it kind of looks normal. We've got our Roman-looking scribe writing at a Roman table, but look at how St. Matthew looks. He is it's like he's electrified. His robes are just like wrinkling, and they're like wavy, and his hair is like flying, and the background is just like all these waving fields of grasses and stuff. It's just really kind of, and it's really kind of expressive in a way that, I think we haven't seen before this. So it makes it just a really fun example. Another kind of just an odd, a different one to look at is the Utrecht Psalter. So a Psalter, you may recall, is a book of Psalms, right? The book of Psalms from the Old Testament that are supposedly written by David, King David. They're supposed to be set to music. And what's fun is, well, first of all, you can see the illustrations are very different. They're not multicolored. They don't use gold. They're like these tiny little sketches. They're, they're not full page illustrations, and they are illustrated. They do give sort of visual representations of what's going on in the text. So that's a fun one. Another example, Psalm 23. And then here's a good example of a cover of a book. This is also from the Carolingian period. So you notice, first of all, how rich it is, right? So the cover is made of gold that covers, that is beaten and then covers a piece of wood that makes the actual cover itself. And then the gold cover is set with a number of different kinds of gemstones, and also with images that are beaten in repoussé from the background. So the image of Christ crucified, the angels sort of, they're sort of writhing in grief, right, over his crucifixion. They're all created in this third dimension by repoussé, which is the act of hammering out from the background, hammering out three-dimensional images in thin sheets of metal like gold. And you can do that with gold because gold is very soft, so you can very lightly manipulate it into these gentle shapes. And then the images that you're seeing, or aside from the images, you're seeing all these gemstones. You're seeing mostly though, I don't know if you can tell the difference. They're polished gemstones. They're not what we would call faceted gemstones. So a faceted gemstone is when it's cut, right? It's cut into so that it looks like it sparkles when the light hits it, right? And these are not. And you notice that it's because they're set into the surface. There's no light hitting from underneath. And when you have a faceted stone, you usually like light to go all the way through it to show it sparkles. That's why, like, if you have, or you know someone who has a diamond ring, you know, like an engagement ring, they're usually open at the bottom so the light can shine through them. Well, these are not that way, and they're not faceted. They are what we call cabochons, okay? So cabochon is a way of, this is in your vocab, a cabochon is a way of fashioning a stone so that it has a flat bottom, typically, flat bottom, and then it's just left sort of a natural curved shape on the top. It might be polished to make it shiny, but it's not going to be cut into facets. So this is set with a large number of cabochons, and you notice that the cabochons sit on top of the surface. They're not inlaid into the surface. They sit on top of it, and therefore, you know, it's a very textured, very bumpy surface. Okay, so just for FYI, it's not really sure. This now covers the Lindau Gospels, as the book is known, but we don't really know what this originally would have covered. Usually book covers are reused if they're of this precious variety. They might be repurposed and reused for other books down the line. So sometimes original books and their covers, in fact, most of the time, they're no longer together after 100 years or more. All right, so let's take a look at some Etonian art. Now, the Etonian Empire is ruled not by Charlemagne anymore and not by the Franks anymore. In fact, well, let's talk about what happened. So what happened to Charlemagne is that, well, let's just face it, the Vikings happened, basically, right? The Vikings happened to Charlemagne. So eventually you have his friends from the north coming in and picking off not only settlements in the Anglo-Saxon and Iberno-Saxon world, but also in the Carolingian world. And he eventually loses power. And so what happens is you have another power vacuum at the end of the Carolingian Empire, and then the Saxons come in. So the Saxons are a Germanic group of people who come in and take over and start what's known as the Etonian dynasty, starting with Otto I. Okay, so the Etonian dynasty is quite a bit more peaceful. There's quite a lot less and in fact, it's really long lasting. I mean, it says here it lasts till 1002, but really it is the beginning of what's known as the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg Empire. It's still a continuous line into the 19th century. So, I mean, the Etonian Empire never really dies. It just becomes something else. Etonian artists also have some similar art forms. They have illuminated manuscripts, they have architecture, and the architecture, like you're seeing in this example of St. Cyriacus and Genrode in Germany, is to continue to build up the Westwork. So this is the western portion of the church. And even though you're looking at this, you see that's an apse. That must be the eastern portion, but it's not. It's actually got two apses, apses, the Church of St. Cyriacus. And you can see here by the double tower on either side, the two stair towers, that this would be the Westwork, right? In fact, here you can see the two apses. Here you can see the western portion with the two spiral staircases, the western apse. And then here's the eastern apse where the altar is. So continuing to build up the Westwork using the same format, one large open nave, side aisles, and also adding on galleries for an upper floor and then a clerestory, right, as we've seen. So one art form that starts to become popular in the Etonian period that will continue to be popular for quite a time into the Renaissance and beyond is bronze doors. Of all things, doors made of bronze panels. So this is the set of doors for the Abbey Church of St. Michael in Hildesheim. And this is a set of doors that was designed by Bishop Bernvard. So Bishop Bernvard sort of had a vision for what these doors would look like, and they're quite an amazing piece of art in that what they do is they have a sort of They have sort of a narrative sense to them. They make sense when you read them from top to bottom and then bottom to top. And they're supposed to bring about sort of an understanding of how the Old Testament and the New Testament work together. So this is really not just an artistic design, but a religious design too. And it is a type of effect that we've encountered before, right? Where you use an old religion like Judaism, the Old Testament, to prop up and to sort of legitimize a newer religion like Christianity, right? Well, we have a name for that we haven't maybe used so far, which is typology. So when we use that in imagery or in text, when we use that technique, where we're using an old tradition to prop up a new tradition, it's known as typology. So we would say this is an example of typology. When we look at the panels, each panel has a section of narrative. This is from your book. It's a diagram that shows each door and what is depicted in each of the panels. And I wish it would stop turning there. So you have at the top on the left creation of Adam. So obviously the beginning of Genesis, the Old Testament, all the way down to the time when Abel's murdered by Cain at the bottom. And then we start from the bottom on the right, start with the Annunciation, which is when God sends an angel down to tell Mary that she's going to have the Son of God. The Annunciation is going to become a very sort of important part of the narrative story of Christ during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It's sort of coming as an important one, as is Nativity. And then ends at the very top on the right with the Ascension into heaven, right? So the Anastasis, right? So it's then what's happening is you're supposed to read we're supposed to read it that way, from top to bottom, bottom to top, but then you're supposed to read them across, and they're supposed to be compared to one another, right? So you can read more about that in your book. In fact, I wouldn't doubt if this ends up being one of your essay questions, so I'll let you read on that at your own time. But this is what typology is, right? When there's a program, basically there's a program to what images are shown in order to allow your viewers to make those connections between older traditions and newer traditions. So here's just an image, a close-up of one of those bronze panels. So these are panels that are cast in bronze, and then they're sort of, welded, or not welded, but they're riveted together into a door. And like I said, the bronze door, the paneled bronze door is becoming a very important art form in the Middle Ages and beyond. I did want to show you the kind of images that are included in this narrative. Very basic, right? What's needed: God, Adam, Eve, the tree, right? The angel. They make it very simple. So here in the crucifixion, we've got John the Evangelist, Virgin Mary, the two Roman soldiers, and Christ, and that's it. And then these little indications that they're on the hill of Golgotha, right? So very economical. We would call designs like this economical, right? That there's not a lot of stuff going on in the background. There's not a lot of side story stuff. It's just the main figures, the main important stuff happening. And notice that we have this again, Middle Ages, the sort of medieval sort of lack of care for making figures look realistic. The Etonians don't care so much about looking Roman the way the Carolingian period, they like things to look Roman. They like them to look realistic. In the Etonian period, we're going to see actually they tend to prefer, honestly, the Byzantine style, the less realistic style more often. Like when I look at this image of Otto I presenting a cathedral to Christ, I see something that looks more Byzantine, right? That looks more like the kinds of images we might see in mosaics in Byzantine churches, where you have hierarchic scale, where you have, the figures not looking quite very realistic, and they're doing things that we would see in Byzantine images too, gifting cities or gifting churches to God or to saints or to the Virgin Mary and so on. So here's Otto holding the church and holding it with a drape over his arm because it's holy, so he's not going to touch it, and he doesn't want to accidentally touch Christ, right? We see Christ with the cross nimbus sitting on an orb, essentially. This is really this is straight out of the Byzantine world, right? So while the Carolingians preferred the Roman style, the Etonians preferred a more Byzantine style. Okay. We see crucifixions. We see the crucifix, right, with the crucified Christ on it. During the Etonian period, this becomes a sort of sculptural narrative image that we really haven't seen very much before. So these wooden crucifixes, and there's a very famous one known as the Giro crucifix, become popular during the Etonian period. Now, Etonian illustrated manuscripts or illuminated manuscripts also, I think, look a little more like the Byzantine ones we might have seen, or at least have used Byzantine style a little bit more. So, like here, we can see the Abbess Hitta and the book she's created for Saint Valpurga, the book known as Hitta Gospels. So this is an abbess who has created and commissioned this book to give to the saint, and so she's giving the book to the saint the same way that Otto was giving the church to Christ, right? And you can see that in the background. You can see her monastery. You can also see the application of a lot of gold leaf, right? And we see a lot of gold leaf in Etonian illuminated manuscripts. Like here, you know, this color looks kind of like this mustard yellow, but this is all gold. This is all gold. It's from the Aachen Gospels of Otto III, and it is the frontispiece for the St. Luke Gospel. So you see St. Luke, his symbol, which is the ox, right? And then you see all this gold in the background. And then here, I mean, so there's this kind of monumental I don't know, kind of sense in these. So for example, so here with Christ washing the feet of the disciples, okay, you really can't get much more of a humble story from the life of Christ, right? Christ gets down on his knees and he washes their feet. He even washes the feet of a woman, right? Mary Magdalene. Extraordinarily humble, right? So this is like such a humble thing to do that everybody's like, what are you doing, Jesus? Right? Like this is such a humble moment in his story, but look at how it's depicted by an Etonian artist. Christ isn't on his knees. He's standing up. He's got his cross nimbus. He's basically sticking his hand in this gesture of blessing in the face of one of his disciples while someone else is bringing water. It's like this incredibly humble scene is transformed into something where he's actually kind of dominating the scene and kind of ominous in a way. I mean, you know, this is the Etonian way. This is the Etonian sort of way of depicting of a narrative scene. We've got all this gold. I mean, it's just like a sheet of gold in the background, right? Same with the Annunciation to the shepherds. I mean, we've got this sheet of gold in the background. But also, we've got, again, a large looming figure with a gesture of blessing basically sticking in someone's face. But at least in this scene, the Annunciation to the shepherds are supposed to be scared. They're supposed to be like, wow, this angel just came to us out of the sky, and they're frightened, right? So at least there's that. But this sort of, you know, using hierarchic scale, using kind of looming, dominating figures, using a lot of gold foil. This is very common with Etonian style. And then our last image is from the Aachen Gospels again, and it shows 2 pages that depict the coronation and veneration of Otto III. So in this gospel book, okay, so this is a book of Gospels, the books that describe the life and passion of Christ, we have also a page, a glorious couple of pages describing the veneration and coronation of a king. So you can kind of see how the Etonian kings see themselves, right? They really see themselves very highly decorated, very richly. So we've got the Etonian king, hierarchic scale, bigger than everybody else, not particularly realistic, very serious, holding an orb, right? Just like we saw Charlemagne or Charles the Bald doing with a cross on it. And on an elaborate throne surrounded by advisors. And then you have over here, you have representatives from the 4 areas of the Etonian Empire, representatives bringing him things. So they're venerating him, that is, they're basically worshiping him, and they're also bringing them their taxes. So we've got Rome, Gaul, Germania, and Slovenia. Right? So we got the 4 main places represented by different ethnicities, represented by different types of clothing, different, you can tell that they're kings, they're wearing different crowns, they're bringing things with their arms wrapped in cloth because they wouldn't want to accidentally touch the Holy Roman Emperor. Remember, he's a Holy Roman Emperor now. So anyway, this, for me, this is a great example of what Etonian style is all about. So that's where we're going to leave it today. When we meet Monday, and I should be at work on Monday, I'm feeling decent today, although I still need, I think, a little time to rest. We're going to talk about chapter 16 and the Romanesque period, and we're going to begin by talking about the pilgrimage routes of the Romanesque period. What's really kind of cool about chapter 16 is you'll see there's a buildup of throughout Spain and throughout France of abbey churches and cathedrals with artwork in them and with relics and reliquaries, with people traveling for hundreds of miles to see by foot, to see these relics and reliquaries and to see the churches. So we're going to talk about those pilgrimage routes. We're going to talk about pilgrimage culture a little bit. So if you would read a little bit about that in chapter 16 before we meet Monday, that would be awesome. See you then.